can't believe we're finally in the same room again.
It's amazing. It feels a long time. It is a long time.
It has. I think, not to reveal the inner machinations of this podcast, but I think it's been over a month since we were last sat in the same room.
I think it is. And you've been to Edinburgh.
Yes.
And I've been to Venice.
Yeah.
Contrasting weather systems.
Yeah, Venice, the Edinburgh of Italy.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's what they call it all the time.
They have the film festival and Edinburgh has every festival.
Yeah. It's brilliant. And so I've been back for a little bit and have been catching up and was lucky enough yesterday to catch up with the years at the Almeida, which I thought was sensational. Have you seen that?
I have not, but I have seen that it caused a bit of a stir during previews.
Yeah, and apparently a man, and it is relevant that it's a man, it is a play about women, and one of the great joys, it's an adaptation of Annie Ernaux's book, and it's utterly wonderful. 5 women playing the 5 different aspects of the character. It's quite graphic at some levels, though very stylized at others. And it does have a very graphic and grueling description of a backstreet abortion in the 60s. And apparently, in preview, somebody passed out during this moment. So you might think that this was the moment that, trigger warnings are really helpful. And it does now have some really fierce trigger warnings about what you're about to see. And you can't avoid them. Sometimes it says if you want to see the trigger warnings, but they are pasted very large on the wall. So nobody fainted while I was there. In fact, what was extraordinary about it, I think, is that I'm really surprised somebody fainted, actually. And I think the difficulty with that story in the run-up to it is that it makes it sound more fierce and darker than it is. I saw a lot of people saying it was one of the best things they'd seen, and it was women. And as a woman, it is an extraordinary description of both life and society from the war, it's where it starts. And it's full of humour and stylization and joy and great depth, as well as kind of one slightly fake blood scene with an abortion. So it's slightly misleading, really.
It's funny how when reading the headlines and even the Almeida's statement, although it sounded from the way they placed it, they were quite dumbfounded by the fact that this had happened. But, this isn't in the same ballpark as something like a Sarah Kane play at the National. It sounds as though it's like you say, far more grounded and not as like in your face, let's see how many pools of blood we can make sort of theatre. Yeah,
and it's directed by Elaine Arbo, who is running Dutch theatre and who's not a director I really knew, with a kind of great lightness of touch. Brilliant adaptation. It's sold out, and I'm sure it's sold out to women. There were so many older women there. That was the other thing. It was a matinee, and there was this great gang of people who obviously thought, you realise actually as a woman how rarely you see your own life reflected in a theatre. And you may not have had what happened to you, but what you feel is that it's a discussion of things you understand. And for a lot of women were in tears and were really moved by it. And it's not because it's sad, it's because it's truthful. And I hope it has another life.
That reminded me of one of the plays that I saw towards the end of the Edinburgh Fringe after we spoke, was Douglas Maxwell's So Young, which was a play, kind of starts off like a version of Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, with 2 couples in very different circumstances going to a dinner party, but actually ends up being a play that's all about older female friendship and female love between friends that have stayed together for decades, that have known each other from, the start of secondary school right the way up until after their children have finished secondary school, or, that sort of experience. And I don't think that is something that you see on stage very often. And it was something, again, that I was noticing yesterday when I was at Hello Dolly with Imelda Staunton, finally catching up on that one.
Both be doing a lot of catching up.
This could be our catch-up episode. Seeing some incredible older female performers taking on some of the most iconic female roles, like Dolly Levi or Irene Malloy, with Imelda Staunton and Jenna Russell, respectively, doing an incredible job on the London Palladium stage. But like you say, telling a story that doesn't really get seen in the glitzy showbiz lights of musical theatre very often.
Yeah, It's true. It's true. Which is probably a good moment both to say hello and welcome to this episode of the What's on Stage podcast with me, Sarah Crompton.
And me, Alex Wood.
And also to outline our theme, which is that there are a lot of good musical revivals, big musical revivals on at the moment. And there may be economic reasons for that, that people want musicals. But it's actually producing a great outpouring of brilliant shows on stage. There's a chorus line up at Sadler's Wells, having come in from Leicester, which I enjoyed in Leicester.
And Kiss Me Kate at the Barbican, which I absolutely was astounded by. And Hello Dolly, obviously. And the day before that, on Tuesday, I was at Oliver.
Wow.
Down in Chichester. So I took a solo road trip down to the coast to see Oliver. Again, a huge, almost maximalist revival. And I do think that we're kind of coming to that post-lockdown era where people are starting to throw a bit more money at these shows and they feel bigger and the ensembles feel bigger and the spectacle feels bigger, which is exciting because I think that it shows that there's a lot of reassurance in the theatre industry that these big productions are coming in and they know that there's an audience for them, and there definitely was an audience for Oliver. It was completely sold out.
It's amazing, isn't it? I've been to see Oliver as well. I mean, people love it.
So for this episode we thought we would go back through our theatrical memories to find the musical revivals that we have adored from years gone by so that we can wax lyrical about them for the next half an hour or so.
Exactly. It's almost impossible as usual to make a top 3 list of them, because actually Oliver, it was interesting because the first time I ever met Matthew Bourne was when there was the very big revival of Oliver, actually much bigger than this one, at the Palladium, where Hello Dolly is, with Jonathan Pryce. And that's one of my highlights when I was thinking about it. I remember just kind of loving that show, and it's a show that everybody knows the lyrics to and everybody can always sing along to. And I love seeing it again, slightly more stripped back, wonderful set, wonderful choreography again by Matthew, and wonderful set by Les Brotherston. But it didn't quite make my top 3, and it's really, really hard to do top 3. I think and you have to sort of set criteria. So what are your criteria that you've set for yourself?
I've gone for productions that felt unique, either because they accomplished something that I never expected to see in the material, or they were created in circumstances that I would never have expected, or they've just lingered with me because they featured casts or creatives that almost, this was the start of their creative journey or midway down their creative journey, and it signaled some of the amazing things that they were going to do further down the line.
So what would your first one be?
So
go first.
Yeah, so this is a slight departure in that I never actually saw it live. So I was going to start with Luke Sheppard's revival of Rent at the wonderfully intimate Hope Mill Theatre in Manchester, which was originally slated to be staged in late 2020. And then obviously, as everyone knows, things did not go to plan for late 2020. So I think they were sort of preparing to go through the motions. They were rehearsing, but it just sort of, I think because of the ways that the lockdowns fell, they were rehearsing with masks on, and I went into rehearsals and I met some people who became huge stars, like Tom Francis, now off to Broadway.
Gosh, yes.
This was his professional debut, and I was the first theatre journalist to ever interview him, and he was terrified on camera, which is hilarious now because he was so comfortable on camera. But that production never got to see more than, I think, 1 or 2 performances, and then it got completely locked down again because those lockdowns were so unpredictable. No one could predict what would happen past the end of the next week. So what they did instead was recorded it, with very little notice in the intimate Hope Mill Theatre. So it almost became like a black box studio space for a film. And then I watched it, I think, I was on holiday during when there were tiers.
Yes,
so I could go to a tiered area where I could stay in an Airbnb. My partner and I watched it on my laptop.
Gosh, and it still makes your top 3.
It still makes my top 3. I think also just at that time of complete adversity, to see loads of cast members who are making their professional debuts, loads of creatives who had this really great idea and this huge amount of love for this show that was, only just over 20 years old, be able to do so in the most adverse conditions and still show the power of community in the face of adversity, and how being a creative can be something that feels noble even at a time when you're not able to come together. And with it, I think almost in a way, because it was in such an intimate space rather than a big West End space, you felt like everyone was fighting the same fight. Both the venue was struggling to stay afloat, all the actors were, having to find ways to get by using alternative jobs when they weren't able to be employed. Everyone was doing this, A, for the love of it, and B, because there was this sheer sense of desperation, I think, on some level, that then this felt like the perfect musical to articulate that.
Yeah, that's brilliant. And it's a brilliant reason to. I think that's often very interesting that, there are so many productions you love, and often the ones that you really remember, and that, when you're trying to think of a top three are the ones that come into your mind, because I think that's the only way you can make those choices, are where somehow there's been an adversity and they've overcome something in getting to the stage. And I think it's absolutely true that one of the wonderful qualities of British theatre in lockdown was that people carried on working and they carried on making work. It's still recovering and still struggling. And I keep having more and more conversations with people about how difficult it is. But nevertheless, people keep on going, and it's joyful, that. And my criteria for my top three, because I find it almost impossible, it is impossible obviously, were versions of shows that saved a musical that's kind of struggling, that has got a problem. And my first one was revelatory, really, to me, which was Carousel at the National Theatre in 1992. And Carousel is, I think, really problematic as a show. And I think it's always been problematic as a show. I think there's no doubt that having as its central plot line a woman who falls for a man who is violent is really tricky. And it was tricky when it came out, and it remains tricky and gets trickier. The thing about the National Theatre's production was, again, I think that it had a whole new youthful creative team. So when I see Janie Dee or Joanna Riding or Clive Rowe, all of whom always to my shock are kind of established now, I always think of them in that production. And I think Nick Heitner, who directed it, brought a kind of vision of the show and thought that you could do it in a different way and let the music sing, really, which, because that's the thing about it. It's got the most amazing score with this problematic plot line. And for me also, the other thing about musicals, because I love dance, is that the choreography has to be good.
Yeah.
And Carousel famously originally had a dream ballet by Agnes de Mille, and Kenneth Macmillan made the dream ballet for this production and died almost immediately afterwards. I mean, it was his last creative piece. All of those things mean that when I look back on it, it's a blur of loveliness. It has blue light and openness, and Bob Crowley's designs stick with me, and the sense of beauty about it, which somehow overcame all the problems in the show, and sadness. It managed to catch that sense of mourning that is at the heart of Carousel, and it really is. In my mind's eye, it's a show I look back on a lot. And Bernadette Peters this week did, friend of the pod, Bernadette Peters. She had her concert this week, and she sang Mr. Snow, which is not something she's ever done on stage. And it just transported me back to how much I love that production and how warm I feel about it, really.
It's interesting how, looking back on the last 40 years of the National Theatre, that was one of the early calling cards that sort of ring-fenced Nick Heitner as being one of those great directors that could get a measure of the venue, could get a measure of the Olivier. And I know he's the associate director at the time under Richard Eyre, but that was one of the early points where the momentum started accumulating, so that by the time it got to 2003, when Trevor Nunn hung up his hat, Heitner was waiting in the wings, ready to leap into that director role.
Yeah, and it's always fascinating that Heitner does understand how to do a musical. I mean, Guys and Dolls, noticeably now, and his calling card was Miss Saigon, and I always think you have that sense of Heitner as being intellectual, thoughtful British director, and yet he's made some terrific musicals.
And even his Shakespeare, it's like rock and roll Shakespeare, like his Midsummer Night's Dream at the Bridge, or even, Julius Caesar at the Bridge also did have actual rock and roll in it. Had a live band to accompany it. So, like you say.
I think that's actually, it's an interesting point that we've stumbled across there. I think the ability to do a musical often shows a director who can do Shakespeare, who can do big classic plays, because there's something about holding a large space and large emotions in a musical that indicates a talent for detailed work and detailed texture work as well, which of course is Dominic Cooke. And I think one of the reasons Dominic Cooke is such a brilliant director is that he can do both. And he directed Hello, Dolly.
Yes, and he also directed my second pick.
That was a cue.
Yeah.
It worked.
We are on the same page, which was Follies at the National Theatre, a second one for the National on this list of our favourites. That incredible 2017 production, just after I started at WhatsOnStage, in fact. So that's partially why I feel very attached to it. It was the first really big mammoth musical revival when I joined. So I kind of learnt the ropes to theatre journalism through that production. But it was just absolutely incredible, wasn't it? That was the first time that I'd actually seen Sondheim realised, because up until that point, there was, the Sweeney Todds of the Into the Woods that you kind of felt like you could easily just get them onto a stage and have some fun with them. But then there, for me, were the more aloof Sondheim musicals, like the Follies or the Sunday in the Park with Georges or the Little Night Musics, that felt like they needed that little bit more intellectual oomph in order to get there. But actually, the thing that Dominic Cooke did so well is that he led you with this beautiful set and these beautiful costumes through this experience that you wouldn't necessarily naturally be drawn to, and actually say, look, there are these incredible women haunted by their pasts that simultaneously both defines them as who they are and who they aren't. Yeah. And I think that tragedy, and I think Follies in so many different ways is a tragic tale.
Totally tragic.
Like tragic on a personal level, on a professional level. It was Dominic Cooke saying, no, I think this is Sondheim's best musical. Yeah. And he made a really strong case for that.
Yeah, and it had some burning performances, I mean, not just Staunton, but Claire Moore doing Broadway Baby, I'll always remember, and Janie Dee again, who was devastatingly upsetting in that part. I think Follies really is a tragedy, and I think certainly it's an elegy. It's an elegy for a past life and past dreams, and it was an astonishingly good production. I have a weird reservation about it, which I can't quite ever explain, but I saw Follies. I'd seen it twice before, and I saw Bernadette Peters do it on Broadway. And again, that's a moment in my life that I just kind of look back on and remember so vividly. And I remember the circumstances of it, and I remember what it felt like. I very often remember what things felt like. It had a magic to it that I can't quite conjure for subsequent revivals. Yeah. So I loved what Dominic Cooke did, and I loved that production. But in my mind, there was always this kind of little definitive one lurking behind it. I also saw it, the first production in London, which of course was a flop, which is what the weird thing about Sondheim is that now we think he's the master that always succeeds. But the first production, which the only performance I remember really vividly is Dana Rigg in it. Though I think Julia Mackenzie was in it as well. And I loved it, and I was a Sondheimite, and I was going along adoring everything. But in fact, critics didn't like it. They didn't get it. There was a sense that it was too overblown and not emotional enough, I think. And it didn't really do very well. And, it was at the Shaftesbury.
Yeah, I was going to say, friends of the podcast might be able to confirm at editorial@whatsonstage.com, but was this where Cameron wanted to knock down the back wall of the Shaftesbury?
Yes, I think it was.
To make space for the show, yeah. Which is ambition over practice.
And he didn't do that well, and he wasn't that loved. And so it is an interesting thing about the changing fortunes of Sondheim's reputation and the way that shows can change. The other thing I didn't like so much about Dominic Cooke is I wanted the choreography to have a bit more snap when they were in the original Follies Girls. And people love the choreography, and I'm afraid I can't remember who it was by. And it was great, but they actually didn't have, there's a kind of snap in the leg that I think American showgirls had that I didn't quite feel I'd have, but that's a very small point. It does bring me to another of my choices, which is Company, Marion Elliott's Company, which again, I think made a problematic show work wonderfully by the simple measure of changing the gender of its protagonists. So, Company is a show with, I think, some of Sondheim's best and wittiest songs in it. It was always slightly difficult. I love the Adrian Lester version at the Donmar, but it was always quite difficult because it had at its heart a sort of self-pitying and slightly isolated man.
Yeah.
And that it was always criticised for that. I never really had that difficulty with it, but I recognise the criticism that why should we care about this bloke who seems to have everything in his life but is miserable all the time. By making the Bobby a woman, Marion Elliott allowed all the kind of agonising to have a reason, because Rosalie Craig very much played it as being fighting against the biological clock.
Yeah.
And therefore jeopardy was introduced into Company, which I think it had lacked. And it was wonderfly staged, Bonnie Christie's set, kind of magical again in its impact, made a star of Jonathan Bailey, who really wasn't somebody anybody had, pre-Bridgerton, and was a memorable night.
It was a show that I remember seeing, I think, early in or mid-preview period for that one. The two things that stand out to me with reference to the biological clock side of things, because 35-year-old woman, this is something that in a large number of cases is going to be at the forefront of their mind. But I think what they did with the orchestration is they actually brought out the wood block, which made it sound like a ticking clock. So you got the tick tock, do 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 do. So that it's always going on in the back of her mind, and obviously the vast majority of the show could be said to be happening entirely in her subconscious. So that clock is always there throughout. The other thing that really stood out to me was I saw it when I was 25, but now coming up to mid-30s, I almost remember it even more fondly than I used to, because I think I am reaching that window where I've got so many of my friends that are 35 that do have so many varying different points in their lives. And I remember there's that one scene during an instrumental section where all the different Bobbies come on, and it's a Bobby that's pregnant, or a Bobby looking after a child, or a Bobby getting ready to go out to a party, or a Bobby just slobbing around at home. And it's how saying, at the age of 35, a woman can be all these things, but Sondheim's original vision for the show never had any sort of indication is that this is what this could mean.
Yeah.
But I think, like you say, Marion Elliott has just completely transformed the show.
Transformed it.
And with Not Getting Married Today, again, I think this was coming in a period just after gay marriage had been legalised. The idea that there were lots of single-sex couples that thought, shall we get married just because we can, rather than because we want to? And actually, what you see with Jamie is that sense of intense paranoia that he's getting married simply because he feels like it's the right thing to do rather than something he wants to. And again, that lends a whole other aspect to Not Getting Married Today that never used to exist. So yeah, I would have totally picked that.
It was brilliant. And also, the whole adaptation of all the different married couples suddenly having a same-sex couple. And it did make such a difference that it broadened it. And interestingly, it was done while Sondheim was still alive, and he helped and he was supportive, and he loved the fact that somebody was looking at a show and reconfiguring it. And that seems to me always a sign of true genius in the people who will allow it, because the danger with shows is that people cling on to them. I mean, actually, Lionel Bart with Oliver is obviously a show that is loved and adored and everybody knows it, but there was a point where he clung on to it a little bit too tightly and wouldn't let people sort of do it in different ways. And I think musicals live if you can make them move to sit in the time that you're watching them as well as the time they're written. And the time Company was written, all those themes couldn't be explored by Sondheim, whereas by 2018 they could, and he was willing to go along with it. And actually, Sondheim, when I was first watching musicals, there was always this idea that there was Sondheim and there was Lloyd Webber, that they were completely antithetical, which I don't think is true. But Lloyd Webber has shown that same willingness to let people look again at his musicals and to alter the perception of them, really, by looking again at them, and actually to reorchestrate them as well. There's been a lot of reorchestration going on.
I've had a lot of thoughts about that recently during my holidays. Clearly, I know how to have fun when I'm thinking about musical revivals whilst on holiday in the sun. There's a lot of talk about, like you say, these radical reinterpretations of musicals, like The Cats in New York or Sexy Oklahoma at the Young Vic.
I loved Oklahoma and in New York.
Yeah, and Fish, also the Cabaret that's at the Kit Kat Club. And, a lot of people see these radical takes as iconoclastic or radical or too far removed. But actually, I do think that by testing them and trying them and prodding them, it's coming from a place of love for the material rather than a disdain for the material. It's not saying, I think this is out of date and rubbish and we need to try something radical in order just to make sure that it's palatable, but actually it's saying there is so much here that is utterly ravishing for audiences that we need to try and find a way for them to access it in the present day rather than feel like they've had to step into a museum in order to find this work. I think that's a recurring theme on this podcast, but it is something that...
Well, that Sexy Oklahoma, which is originally Daniel Fish, who does it in New York, and then it comes the Young Vic. I still, that actually in many ways is my absolute top revival. And the only reason I haven't made it my top revival is it feels a bit too near because it was very recent and I kind of like time to settle. But there was no doubt that revealed a different show and allowed, again, we have talked about this before, it allowed the women in it to emerge in a different way. Oklahoma is problematic for a lot of reasons, but one of the problems is that you've got this kind of central woman who kind of can't seem to make up her mind, and it gave reasons for that inability to make up her mind, and by making everybody a much more complex character, so everybody is black and white, and the shades of grey made that Oklahoma not just sexy, but also fascinating because it was so dark.
It's funny coming back to see that show when it transferred to the West End from the Young Vic, because initially you think Curly and Laurie is just the go-to, and actually at the Young Vic they kind of muddied it so it didn't feel like it was entirely qualified as a relationship. But by the time I saw it in the West End, I was entirely Judd and Laurie need to be together. Why is Curly being such a horrible, mean villain here? And I think Anushka Lucas, who's playing the role, kind of tipped it further and further towards Judd, so that by the end of the show, everyone was like, oh my gosh, you've murdered the main romantic hero of this musical.
Yeah, Patrick Vale made Judd the most sympathetic character on the stage, which was an astonishing turnaround because normally he is villainous, and to see him as an outsider, sad, lovely, sexy. I mean, I thought he was the sexy character.
Let me rattle quickly onto my third pick. And this is one I think I've chosen because I don't think, again, it could ever exist ever again or exist in the same way, which was the socially distanced production of Jesus Christ Superstar at Regent's Park Open Air Theatre. Obviously, we love Regent's Park Open Air Theatre because we talk about it all the time.
We are at the moment.
Yes. Summer. It's summer. We're allowed. We won't talk about it later. There, again, because they're having to do the entire production socially distanced, it really felt like you could see the director having to factor in all of these parameters around, Judas can't touch the box of coin that he's having to come out of. So how is he going to do that? And Jesus can't have the crown of thorns placed on his head. He'll have to put that on his own head. What does that then mean? And what starts happening is you're almost taking this biblical tale that already has been completely reconfigured and distorted by Tim Rice in the original musical, and then adding this whole other layer of distance and isolation and misinterpretation to it. So, you're literally having to have these romantic ballads where these two people can't touch. So Mary and Jesus have to occupy different sections of the stage and yet somehow have a believable romance. be completely unable to touch one another. And in a way that lends itself to everything that Mary sings about, because she doesn't feel like she can touch Jesus anymore, because he's becoming this figure that goes so far beyond a man, and he's becoming a message or a symbol that in a way he is inaccessible at this point. I thought that was absolutely brilliant.
It is true. It was amazing. And it was. You're right. I was going to make my third, Jamie Lloyd's Evita, also at the open air, which had a similar quality of, I mean, it wasn't done in lockdown, but it had a similar quality.
Same set as Jesus Christ Superstar.
Same set, because they used the bleachers. And and that was cost, I think, because of when it opened. And yet it had the same quality of making everything stripped back. And my problem with Evita as a musical had always been that it's too big and there's too much sense around of sort of props and dressing around her. And I found that tricky. I haven't actually really ever liked Evita. So it was the first time I had really liked Evita and realised how brilliant the singing was, because there was nothing else except the singing and the movement. But actually I'm going to slightly reverse, and I am going to have that Oklahoma as my third choice, because when I think about it, again, a difficult show and the change in women's characters and women's lives, I think that Oklahoma probably had slightly more. So I'm going to change.
One point on Oklahoma that struck me, having seen it at both spaces, was in the West End, because they boarded off all the wings and everything. It felt like no one could escape.
Yeah.
Whereas when it's done in the Traverse at the Young Vic, it felt like you were watching a thoroughfare of people coming past you and coming on and off stage, whereas in the West End it felt so much more claustrophobic and intense and horrible and like a thriller, and you knew something terrible was going to happen, which it does. I think it's
the first time I saw it, that was in New York, and that had the same claustrophobic sense, and you could smell, you smelt the plywood, you were in the barn, but also because it was pre-pandemic, they did do the thing where you joined in the food, and so you could go and have the corn and the and the chowder, and it meant that you were part of a community that you then watched separating in front of your eyes, which was such a radical feeling and notion that, it was very special. So I'm going to stick with that now.
Wonderful. Well, I think on that note of U-turning departure, if you've got your own favourite musical revivals, please do email us at editorial@whatsonstage.com. We love every email that we get, and they provide some very interesting tidbits and insights. And make sure you like, follow and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts or videos. And in the meantime, I think it's time for us to say goodbye.
So it's goodbye from me, Sarah Crompton.
And a goodbye from me, Alex Wood.